everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Sabiha Rahman.
I'm Walter Ruby.
I am an American Muslim.
And I'm an American Jew.
And we refuse to be enemies.
We certainly do.
Today, we are honored to welcome our guest, Mustafa Akyol, author of the newly published book, The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Muslims and Jews to Flourish Together and Save the World.
Mustafa Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. He's the author of several acclaimed books, such as Islam Without Extremes, The Islamic Jesus, and Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. For nearly a decade, he was contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and he currently teaches classes at Boston College and the Foreign Service Institute. In July 2021, the Prospect magazine of the UK listed him as among the world's top 50 thinkers. Welcome, Mustafa, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Sabiha, for your kind introduction and for welcoming me to your podcast, which is, I think, more important than ever in this very difficult time. Yeah, we should refuse to be enemies, and I think reminding ourselves of better times between Jews and Muslims, I think, in history is a way to do that, and that's what my book is partly about. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. So tell us, Mustafa, why did you choose the title Islamic Moses?
It actually goes back to my earlier book that you mentioned, Islamic Jesus. So Islamic Jesus, how the King of the Jews became a prophet of the Muslims. So that was the subtitle. It was published in 2017 by St. Martin's Press, the same publisher I am now. And I mean, it was a book that did well, and a lot of people bought it, and it was discussed, and the publisher was happy with that. And a few years later, they asked for a sequel to the book, and what would be the sequel to Islamic Jesus? I said, well, I can write about the Islamic Moses, and they were happy about it. And that's the beginning of the book. But then I also realized that while the Quranic story of Moses, which would be the focus of this story, is interesting in itself, it's also the beginning of a bigger story that I always wanted to tell, the story of the Judeo-Islamic tradition. It's a term that was used by a few scholars, including the late, great Bernard Lewis. It's a story that surprises many people in the West, especially Americans, because people are used to hearing about the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is a 20th century invention, by the way. But there was a Judeo-Islamic tradition too. It doesn't look very bright at this time, but for centuries there was something you could call like that. So I decided to use the Islamic Moses story, the story of Moses in the Quran and the place of Moses in Islam, as the beginning of a larger story here. That's why the book begins with actually the Quranic story of Moses, the Moses of Mecca. Then it gets into discussions about what happened in Medina, then how Jews and Muslims and Islam and Judaism as two religions, how they unfolded in history and what were the interactions between them. And this was not a totally positive interaction. I mean, it's fair to say that, but there are a lot of positivities in it. There are a lot of bright spots. And the book doesn't negate the negative parts, but highlights the positive parts, which to many people comes as surprising, even incredulous, to think that Muslims and Jews found themselves on the same side of history in many cases, because today's reality is unfortunately very different. But I also make the argument that today's reality is a product of politics and geostrategic facts, rather than really theological tension between the two religions.
Mustafa, when I read the book, what I took from the title, was that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is being referred to as the Islamic Moses, because of how God in the Quran invokes the stories of and the experiences of Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, as a role model for Prophet Muhammad, which I was fascinated by. That's just such an interesting way of looking at the history of our prophets.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I should tell this by, reminding that when you read the Quran, there's something really surprising, and some new readers of the Quran are surprised, as I relate in the beginning of the book. If you expect in the Quran to learn about Prophet Muhammad, you will not learn much. You will not learn how he was born and raised, and you'll not get a biography of him, because the Quran doesn't speak about him; it rather speaks to him, as I say. But you will learn about former prophets whose stories are told to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the first Muslims, to inspire them, to enlighten them about. But among them, by far, the most dominant figure is Moses. I mean, he's the most mentioned human figure in the whole Quran, by far more than anyone else, 137 times. In comparison, the name Muhammad is found in just 4 verses, just 4 times. I was actually at a conversation yesterday, and I asked, can you guess who is the second most mentioned human figure in the Quran after Moses? And people said, oh, probably Abraham or Jesus maybe, or no, it's the Pharaoh, the nemesis of Moses. And the struggle between these two men, Moses and the Pharaoh, dominates some important surahs, chapters of the Quran, and you read it over and over. Now, why is this the case? And I mean, as a few Western scholars have noted, and that's my opinion too, because their story strongly resonates with the story of the first Muslims. For Moses is the exact role model for Prophet Muhammad, as an orphan who grows up, who didn't know that he would be a prophet, but one day on the top of a mountain, he hears the divine voice, burning bush in the case of Moses, and Prophet Muhammad in a cave in Hira. So they become prophet unexpectedly, and they have a difficult mission to save their believers from persecution. That's why it's not an accident that the Moses Pharaoh stories in the Quran are almost all narrated in the Meccan period, when Prophet Muhammad and the first Muslims are persecuted. So they strongly identify with the Israelites. And actually, we have how the Israelites are saved through Exodus. We have an counterpart to that, which is the Hijrah. It's a migration that saves you from persecution. And after that, though, you establish a kind of a polity. There are some battles. So actually, there's some political aspect of the mission as well. On that aspect too, Prophet Muhammad's mission has similarities with Moses, and then Joshua and the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, let's say, the story there. That's why he's the paradigmatic prophet. And in the first chapter of my book, I read the stories of Moses in the Quran with references to Prophet Muhammad and his experience. And I emphasize that these are Meccan stories for a good reason.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for all of that and laying that out. I'm wondering if when you chose the subtitle to the book, The Islamic Moses, which is how the Prophet inspired Muslims and Jews to flourish together and save the world.
Change the world, sorry.
To change the world. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Change the
Yes.
world. I'm sorry.
You're
So were you aware that it might make some Jews uncomfortable, including many sympathetic to your overall message of Muslim friendship and trust? Now, so what do I mean by that? I think that, most Jews, and obviously myself, would readily agree, and also myself being someone who is very sympathetic to your overall message. But I think we would readily agree that the experience of the Jews in the Muslim world for 1,200 or so years was much, much better than in the Christian one, and they were treated far better by the Muslim authorities than the Christian authorities. But I'm wondering if you can really characterize that experience as flourishing together, because after all, you were in a situation where the Muslims were in complete control of theocratic states, including both the caliphates of the early centuries of Islam and then also the Ottoman Empire. And whereas the Jews were a protected dhimmi minority, a subordinate people who had to pay the jizya tax and were sometimes were forced to live in ghettos and distinguish themselves by dress. Obviously, every Muslim that I know and everybody that I've dialogue with over the years talks about the beautiful golden age of Al-Andalus and the Maimonides and his connections, his role in all of that. And yet Maimonides, as we know, in his teenage years, was forced to flee with his family from Cordoba, the capital of Al-Andalus, because of the more fundamentalist group called the Almohads had taken over there, etc. So, and again, I want to again say that overall, it was much better than that. It was much better than the situation at that moment in Cordoba. But again, can one really talk about flourishing together, quote unquote, the term you use, when one community is in complete control and the other is a protected minority?
Thank you, Walter. That's a very good question. I should say that I use the term flourishing together in the subtitle with a implicit reference to the concept of symbiosis, which was used by Shlomo Goitain, who was one of the towering scholars of medieval Islam and Judaism of the 20th century. He says there's a symbiosis of Jews and Muslims throughout the medieval centuries, which means living together. And the term flourish has been used. Jews flourished under Muslim rule in medieval times. There are many references to that. You can find that term used by Eli Barnavi, other historians that I mentioned, that in the book. I mean, there's a whole Jewish scholarship on this. Of course, there are differences there. Some think that maybe it's too defined too romantically. Others think no, it was more stark, and there are different schools of thought too. Now, but I mean, I agree with Eli Barnavi or Goitain on that there was really some good experiences there that we should highlight today. So there has been some flourishing together, and that includes also scholarship too. I mean, I show how Muslims and Jews shared theologies, right? I mean, how Mu'tazila theology in Islam influenced Saadia Gaon and later Maimonides, and it had an input into Judaism. And I show how Muslims studied Israeliyat in Jewish sources and learned from them. So there's been mutual, just not living together, but also interaction in a positive way. So the book has many episodes of that. There is a chapter of Sufism influencing the son of Abraham, the great Moses Maimonides. His son Abraham became a Sufi and brought into Sufi practice into Judaism. Now, but your question is true, Walter, in the sense that I'm not arguing that medieval Islamic world was like today's America or a liberal democracy where you have equality under the law. It wasn't. But I'm not judging it by today's standards. If we judge it by today's standards, we can say, oh my God, I mean, this is second-class citizenship. There's discrimination. Yeah, all these terms you can bring up against the non-Muslims. So Muslims are superior. And Muslims were clear about that. Yeah, they were the ruling people, and the others were the ruled people. That is Jews and Christians. So I wouldn't romanticize it from a modern perspective, and I would not want to revive it today, as some people may want to do. I think liberal democracy with equal citizenship is a better model. And actually, much of my work is about how do we synthesize Islamic ideas with the tenets of liberal democracy, freedom of religion, speech, equality under the law, and so on and so forth. However, I think we will be making a mistake by judging the past by today's standards, right? I mean, you can say America in the 90s was a tyranny for gay people because there was no gay marriage yet. I mean, yes, but it was an evolution. Also, one thing, so that status for its time was the most tolerant status Jews found. The alternative was medieval Christianity, which was often much less free than the Muslim world. And this has been acknowledged by many people. I mean, Baron Lewis says Islam gave more freedom to people compared to any of its contemporaries and many of its predecessors. And that is why it is important to highlight that nuance, and people judge the past. Now, were there dark episodes? Definitely. For example, the Almohad persecution in Spain that you mentioned. I mean, Moses Maimonides, his family were forced to convert into Islam, right? The
Mm-hmm.
Almohads actually ended the dhimmi status of non-Muslims
Right.
because they thought that the deal is over now. This is towards the end of times, and they have to convert into Islam. Now, that was a very heavy persecution, and they had to flee from that. But where did Maimonides go? I mean, he escaped to Egypt, where he found the usual Islamic, tolerance again. And his son, Abraham Maimonides, as I said, became the head of the Jewish community after him. He became a practicing Sufi, tried to bring those ideas into Judaism. So for its time, I think we should understand, and I think history should never be judged by our modern day standards, by its own standards. So that's what I would say. Also, I mean, um, there are many episodes. Like, I mean, people may be surprised to learn that Jews were banned from Jerusalem for centuries by Romans, first the pagan, then the Christian Roman. But then they were allowed to return. Even they were facilitated to return to Jerusalem under Islamic rule, for example. Or Muslims and Jews were slaughtered by the Crusaders, which actually targeted both communities. And then only after defeating the Crusaders, both communities could live and practice again in Jerusalem. So I think it's important to highlight those. Not that model was ideal for today, but for its time, it was remarkable. One more thing, the protected dhimmi status of Jews and Muslims, which, as you said, included certain discrimination, extra taxation, and jizya. That's the most important. That was abolished by the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, gradually. The Ottomans in the Tanzimat reform period brought in a lot of Western ideas and institutions, liberal ideas and institutions. And that included equality under the law, which gradually, first with the Tanzimat, then the Islahat Edict of 1856, then the Constitution of 1876, became the norm. And that's why actually you have Jews entering Ottoman bureaucracy, entering the Ottoman parliament as elected parliamentarians in the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. So Islamic civilization had its own evolution towards even a more liberal citizenship as well in the Ottoman Empire. Unfortunately, the empire fell tragically with a lot of violence, unfortunately, too. But also conceptually, there was a shift there towards a better direction as well already.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Now, in your book, you quote David Wasserstein, who's the professor of Jewish studies, saying that Islam saved Jewry. How so?
Well, he's one of the scholars who actually used the term flourishing under Islam. He says Jews did flourish. I mean, it's an article, people can read it. It's on Jewish Chronicle. It's if people type Islam say Jewry in quotation marks, probably it will show up. And I mean, he kind of gives a short in that article, which is, I think, a version of a lecture he had given at London SOAS School of Oriental African Studies. He gives a short summary of what I discuss in a few chapters in the book, and that is when Islam appeared in the world scene, the world looked pretty bleak for Jews. They were most of them were either under the rule of the Byzantine Empire or the Sassanid Empire, both of which would be gradually, Sassanids quickly and the Byzantines gradually would be actually destroyed and inherited by Islam. And in both cases, the status of Jews got highly improved, especially compared to the Byzantine Empire. And people may not know, but the Byzantine Empire, that's the Eastern Christian empire centered in Constantinople. They had pretty anti-Semitic laws and narratives, teachings, and Jews were heavily persecuted. They were forced to convert. There were bannings of Talmud. They were even worse in Visigothic Spain. Jewish children were taken away from them, forced to convert. There was like brutal persecution, and these are noted in Jewish sources. And that's why it's not an accident, by the way, when Muslim armies started conquering territories of Byzantium or the Visigothic Spain, Jews supported these conquests. I mean, that shows you that something, right? I mean, they certainly saw, yeah, again, it's not today's America, but they said, oh my God, the Muslim rule is much better for us. And Muslims looked to Jews as this minority that they would trust, right? That's very clear, especially in the case of Spain. And regarding the Sassanids were actually, the Sassanid Empire, whose religion was Zoroastrianism, was actually more tolerant to Judaism. So Jews actually sided with the Sassanids. That's also an interesting geostrategic context, which I discuss in one of the chapters in the book, in the Medina chapter, what really happened in Medina. But even there, the status Islam gave to Jews looked more favorable. And also, the scholar you mentioned, he says, thanks to Islam, the scholarship of Iraq was able to connect with the Jewish communities in the West as well. So, I mean, people can read that. He actually gives a good summary of that. Again, people find it surprising, incredible, but that's precisely why I think it's important to highlight this much forgotten history. Forgotten by, it's not a history today to delegitimize Jewish national aspirations, regarding Israel. It's not a model to, oh, we need a new caliphate and a kind of a new Zimmi system. Some groups in the Muslim world will think like that. That's not my argument. I think there's evolution in history towards equality, legal equality, and that's a good thing. But the contributions of Islam, I think, to Judaism, and the contributions of Judaism to Islam, which I try to highlight both in the book, are important. And that was one article that was putting things in a nutshell in a good way.
So following up a little on that, in the book, you talk about the Quran's unifying message regarding the relationship of Muslims and with Jews, such as the prophet Moses, and respect for people of the book. So I'd like to hear more about that. But also, how do you reconcile that unifying message with what many Jews see as hostile characterizations of Jews and Judaism in the Quran? And just to, a few quick ones. Jews were, chastised for killing their prophets, Quran 570, worshiping other gods, 930 to 31, breaking their covenant, 282, claiming that heaven is exclusively for Jews, 294, slandering God, 450, spreading corruption, 564, mocking the faith of Muslims, 558, and being ungrateful to God, 45, 16, 17. So maybe you can address both of those points.
Definitely. Those chapters, those passages in the Quran, especially which you can read in the Medinan surahs, especially in Baqarah and a few others, are one of the reasons why I have a chapter, what really happened in Medina, right? I mean, now a few things. Some of the Quran is ambiguous when it comes to Jews, and that's a term used by the Israeli scholar Meir Bar Asher, who wrote this book, Jews in the Quran. And I was lucky to write a foreword to that book, which was published a few years ago by Princeton, I think, University Press. It's a good book, and if anyone who wants to really look into what the Quran is speaking about the Jews, that book is a good one. I think I would recommend it. Now, ambiguous in this sense. On the one hand, the Quran appreciates Judaism, certainly shows great respect to all the Jewish prophets, and, for example, says Jews noted that God had chosen Jews, at least for a time, right? And it recognizes their religion as legitimate, just like Christianity. By the way, with Christianity, there's a tension over the doctrine of Trinity and the theological aspect of it. In Judaism, there is no such tension at all, right? Staunch monotheism, both religions are pretty same on that. And Maimonides, emphasize that, with the Ishmaelites, we agree with that. By the way, before I forget, Maimonides, I'm just jumping back, but has a statement about the Ishmaelites being very brutal, persecuted. I think he was referring to the Almohads, which is very understandable. I mean, the people who wrote biographies of Maimonides, at least one of them I can share, he says this is related with his context of being, well, the Ishmaelites are clearly Almohads who persecuted his family. But I think it can be seen in a broader sense. I think it doesn't have to be. Anyway, coming back to our topic about the Quran. So there are certain like affirmations of the truth of the Jewish tradition. On the other hand, there are, as you said, critical passages towards Jews in the Medinan period. Now, I have two arguments about that. One of that is some of the criticisms that the Quran brings against Jews are also criticisms that the Torah brings against the Jewish people. I mean, the golden calf story is narrated in the Quran. Well, it's in, obviously it's in the Bible too. So there are biblical passages where Jewish prophets, Moses or others, criticize their community for not being loyal to the word of God. And well, the Quran, keeps that same tradition. So in other words, at some point, the Quran criticizes Jews for not being good Jews and asks them to be better Jews and to be loyal to their tradition, which is also an interesting theme. I mean, the Quran in one sense asks the Christians to be loyal to their tradition and Jews to be loyal to their, while it's also criticizing the Jewish community itself, the Muslim community, itself, when they fail to be obedient or when they fail to be steadfast in the religion. On the other hand, there is a polemical tone, and to me, that polemical tone comes from the political conflict that emerged between Prophet Muhammad and the first Muslim community and the Jewish tribes in Medina.
Sure.
So they are contextual. In other words, they're not these universal statements about the Jewish people and their religion and their nature. It's about these three tribes, Beni Kainuka, Beni Nadir, and Beni Qurayza, which apparently first had a good constitution in the beginning, but then it devolved into a conflict. I discussed why it could be the case. But that's why some of the polemics there are very isolated. I mean, Jews are accused for saying Uzair is the son of God. Well, you don't find that belief among Jews, and that's been brought up by the critics of the Quran for centuries. And actually, Islamic scholars like Fakhreddin al-Razi, exegetes of the Quran, realize that, well, Jews don't believe in this thing, or to say God's hand is shackled. They don't believe that. So, but maybe there was one guy who said that back in Medina at the time. Or maybe there was a specific Jewish belief about Enoch, which could be like, deifying him, seeing him as son of God. Maybe there was an eccentric Jewish belief in that particular community. So, in other words, when the Quran is speaking about Jews, it might be simply speaking about some of the people in the city of Medina in the year 620s, right? You shouldn't project it to a universal stereotype. Same thing with Christians as well. And that's why sometimes the Quran is positive, sometimes is negative, because things are happening there. I mean, that's also relevant to my own reading of the Quran as an interactive scripture, as I put it in an earlier book. The Quran is not just speaking absolutely on human categories. Sometimes it does. Sometimes says, "Oh, humans," right? Or when it brings it like a totally theological question, like on Trinity, I think its statements might be more everlasting. But sometimes it's just something happening with the people there. Now, in the modern era, what a mistake done by some Muslims is to take those negative statements in the Quran and turn them into stereotypes about Jewish people. Like the infamous first charter of Hamas, for example, had a section about how Jews are launching all the wars in the world and are behind all the wars. They refer to a Quranic verse. Well, that Quranic verse is referring to either Banu Nadir or Banu Kainuka being a part of the Uhud campaign, which was, I think, historically true, or, I mean, plausible, at least, you can say from a historical point of view. So, this Israeli scholar that I mentioned, Be'er Ashar, also says the same thing. He says Islamists, in the context of conflict with Israel, absolutized certain Quranic polemics, while actually the Islamic tradition saw them as sometimes more contextual, right? And I think that's something, unfortunately, religious communities do. When you are angry at a community, you find the thing in your scripture which you can use as a weapon. I can see both sides sometimes doing that, unfortunately, in the Israeli conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict. But that's what we should avoid and try to put scripture in its proper meaning and context.
Well, thanks so much. That was really, really helpful. Both in, you made, I just wanted to say that when I've had those conversations, I don't think I've had as full a conversation as we just had, or full as of an explanation of these comments. But when I have spoken to imams in the past and Muslim leaders, they usually cite the first point that you made, that yes, it says much of the same in the Torah, and that when I was working on the book with Sabia, our book, a few years back, that really was important for me to kind of process, because yeah, I mean, so why am I getting more upset about what what it says in the Quran than what it says in the Torah, about the same incidents, about the golden calf, etc. And what it came up with was, well, every community, I think it's just a very human tendency, has a certain level of self-criticism and sometimes even making fun of themselves. We're allowed to do that. In some, Black comedians and others and rappers are allowed to use the N-word, but God forbid anyone else would do that. And so it's some kind of an analogy there. But anyway, I think that's a big part of it, and obviously, but the other points you made about it being related to what was happening in Medina, I think makes a huge amount of sense. I guess the tragedy is, though, that that's relating to a certain time and place, which is in a sense long gone. I mean, and yet it because it's the holy book, in the same way, I'm sure the same situation with the Torah, with the Amalekites and many other seemingly genocidal things were related to a certain time and place, and yet we're dealing with them for eternity. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, scripture is scripture. We're not going to be able to, in Islam, you don't even consider any alteration of scripture. But understanding scripture in context and in a way that is not going to channel hatred and extremism, but rather understanding and empathy. Yeah, there are conflicts there, and those conflicts were reflected. But again, there are things in the scripture to go against that stereotypization too. I mean, I mentioned that whenever the Quran criticizes Jews or Christians, it says, but there are good people among them too, but not they are all the same. So even in that context, it is actually making a distinction between those who are hostile. I mean, there's a famous, there's a Quranic verse, but sometimes people quote either as a hardline Islamist or a critic of Islam. Don't take Jews and Christians as friends. So there's a verse about that. But there's another verse in the 60th chapter surah, which says, God holds you from taking friends only those people who have attacked your religion and expelled you from your homes. If they've not done that, be just to them, and God loves justice. So it actually shows you that if it is speaking about a group of Jews or Christians, it's speaking about a context. Those people, there's a conflict there. If there's no conflict, you can be good with them. So that is, I think, already in the Quran, in the text itself. So what we choose to highlight, even in the text, in the Bible too. You mentioned the commandments about Amalekites, which is very concerning, right? For ages, and I'm very concerned to see it today. Here it's
used for the Palestinians, essentially.
Yeah,
exactly.
in Israel, which is very, very horrific reference in my view. But I know biblical passages which says, you were strangers in Egypt, so you will not wrong a stranger. So your past persecution becomes a source for empathy. That's also in the Bible. So I would be happy to see Jewish people emphasizing that part, and rather the Amalekite part, and seeing the other one is more of a historical.
Yeah, especially since Maimonides himself did a whole learned piece on this and said that, we're commanded to kill every Amalekite, but they're gone. There aren't any more Amalekites now in the year 1200 AD. So now what we have to do is kill the Amalek inside ourselves, and those kind of things, which so much of that in the so-called oral tradition.
That's like spiritual jihad. Sounds like.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
And also, if I may add, the Quran also gives us permission to marry people of the book. We can marry Jews, we can marry Christians, and that is the most enduring and intimate relationship that you can have with another, which is, spousal relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But so moving back to history, in reading your book, I was not aware of the role of Rabbi Muharrik in the battle between Prophet Muhammad's tribes and the pagans at Uhud. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, that's fascinating. I mentioned that in Medina, there were Jewish tribes with which first Prophet Muhammad, drafted and signed a constitution. We call it a constitution today. It's called a Sahifa or book, but it's a document. We don't have the original document, but there are references, there are quotations of it, which seem very authentic. And there it says, to Jews their religion, to Muslims theirs, and Medina is divided as city-state. And Jews are given the responsibility, just like Muslims themselves, to defend their city in the case of an attack on the city. And it's clear that some Jews signed this treaty and joined this new community that Prophet Muhammad devised in Medina right after arriving in Medina. Now, that's actually a remarkable story because it shows that the first state that Prophet Muhammad established was not an Islamic state. It was a pluralistic state, right? Jews and Muslims have this, and Medina is a territorial state, so it's actually not. It's not based on religion; it's based on territory, like citizenship as we imagine today. Now that collapses with there are conflicts with those three major tribes. But then we come to this Battle of Uhud, which is several years later. Then you hear it should be at least 4 years later after the migration. Then you come to this story of a Jewish rabbi named Muharrik going to war with the Muslims against the pagan Meccans, idolaters who are trying to take the revenge of the first war in Badr. And Muharrik fights with them, falls as a martyr, and he's buried next to the Muslims, and Prophet Muhammad calls him the best of the Jews. And now that's a fascinating story. Now, later Islamic tradition assumed mostly that he probably converted into Islam. That's why he was fighting with us. But actually, there's no reason to think that he converted. He could be simply a Jewish leader in the city who was still sympathizing with Muslims and who was loyal to the conditions of the Medina constitution, right? And he could have remained as a Muslim and just fighting with the Jews as monotheists. Now, this is a glimpse of a larger story, which is and it brings to a question, and I think that's a major question. Did Muslims want from Jews to convert into Islam? And that's the only acceptable condition? Or did they just want their friendship and maybe affirmation, but still they can stay in their religion and be in the same political group organization with Muslims, which is the Medina state? I tilt towards the second answer. That, I mean, Muslims, it seems that they wanted Jews to recognize Muhammad as a legitimate prophet. It was important for them because Jews are this old, ancient, quintessential monotheists, right? So their affirmation at a time when Prophet Muhammad is struggling to win more Arabs would mean a lot. So there is a demand for that. But I don't see a demand for them to abandon their religion and to become practicing Muslims, right? Like, accept us, but and also be friends with us, and let's fight against the polytheists. So there is that sort of, I think, message in the Quran. And Muharrik seems to show that, Rabbi Muharrik, who fought with the Muslims, seems to show that maybe some individuals or some Jewish tribes were in that direction. Other tribes went to another direction, a more hostile one, and there's hostility and there's violence. So that's another story. bu- and I mean, it connects us to the bigger question of how pluralistic early Islam was. You may be familiar with Fred Donner, his famous book, Muhammad and the Believers. He actually says that Islam emerged as a movement of believers, mu'minun, believers of any monotheistic tradition. Now, I don't know how accurate is that, but there's certainly room to see more pluralism, religious pluralism, monotheistic pluralism, I think, in the beginning of Islam. And Rabbi Muhayrik, the martyr, the Jewish martyr of Islam in the Battle of Uhud, I think gives a glimpse of that. But the bigger story may not be ever known, but there's a room to theorize that Islam could be totally at peace with the Jewish tribes in Medina. They could have remained Jewish, and they could have just kept being a part of the new Islamic state that was emerging. It didn't work that way, but then in Yemen, Muslims conquered Jews. They still left there with their religion. So Muslims never tried to convert Jews into Islam, at least forcibly, until the Almohads, which was an exception, a dark exception, of course.
It sounded to me from the book and sort of what you're saying now that well, first of all, I just wanted to say that the book by Rabbi Firestone was a big influence on me, Islam for Jews, and I think you mentioned too, and his analysis seemed to be that it was kind of an existential tragedy, that the Muslims were really demanding that the Jews at least recognize Muhammad as a prophet. That would have been a violation of who they were and of their belief structure. So they really couldn't, and so you really so it seems almost kind of and one totally understands why the Muslims wanted it. One understands why the Jews were not able to do it, and then that does lead us to this incident of the Bani Qurayza and and the story of them of the massacre of 700 or 800, which I gather you basically are in your book throw some doubt on whether that really happened. And I'm just curious on that point. While debunking that incident would certainly remove a source of deep pain in Muslim-Jewish relations, might it not also seem to be a kind of a whitewashing of an event that, after all, is mentioned both in Quranic and verses and Hadith?
Thank you, Walter. Good. Both questions are very good. One thing is, of course, Rabbi Firestone's works are great, and I myself learned a lot from him. I also got some help from him for this book too, and he wrote a very kind blurb for the book, which you can see at the back. I mean, I agree with him on many things. In this book, though, in my book, I highlighted the political aspect of the conflict a bit more than merely the theological aspect of it. That's why I discussed the Byzantine-Sassanid conflict there, which was a context to the conflict in Medina between Muslims and Jews. Muslims found themselves more sympathetic to Byzantine Empire, Jews more Sassanid. Why is that the case? That's a long story, but people can see in the book. So I'm kind of trying to bring in some political aspect to it rather than merely a theological tension. But one more thing, I think there have been Jews Jewish scholars who actually accepted the theological legitimacy of Prophet Muhammad while still remaining as Jews. And I think the one that I mentioned in the book is the 12th century Jewish scholar Nathanael ben al-Fayyumi. He said, God sent different prophets to different peoples. So Muhammad is indeed a prophet to Gentiles. So Gentiles should follow Muhammad. We as Jews, we have our religion, so we're going to keep it. We follow the law of Moses. So that is a way of accepting the legitimacy of Prophet Muhammad, Islam, without giving up on your Judaism. And I think there are scholars, Jewish scholars, who think that way. Because ultimately, from a Jewish perspective, Islam is a religion that brought many Gentiles into monotheism. Before that, they were polytheists, but Islam brings them to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael, right? And it's been appreciated, I think, by many Jewish scholars. That's why they saw Islam as a daughter religion, just like Christianity. So both Islam and Christianity universalized theological beliefs that were previously only in Judaism, historically speaking. And Christianity did it in a more complicated way, the doctrine of Trinity. Islam did it in a more clearly Jewish way in terms of a staunchly Unitarian monotheism. Going back to the issue of Bani Qurayza. Now, in those stories of conflict with Jews in Medina between Prophet Muhammad and the first Muslims, indeed, there are three tribes there, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Bani Qurayza. So the first two ones are expelled from the city. And because they're Muslims suspect that they're colliding with the enemy, that's the pagans. Now, the third story is a more grim one, where you have not just, you don't have expulsion, you have the killing of males, and women and children are enslaved. Now, this is read in standard Sirah, biography traditions. It's there where if you read a biography of Prophet Muhammad and you read the Qurayza story, that's what you're going to see. And until the modern era, this was challenged that much. But I think in the past couple of decades, there have been Muslims who doubt the authenticity of the story. Now, can we doubt the authenticity of the story, first of all? Walter, you said it's in the Quran. It's not clear in the Quran that there was such a big massacre. I mean, the Quran, in the relevant verse, it says you were killing some and you were taking others prisoners. It could be there was a war and some people were combatants and they were killed. So it could be just men. Some men were killed in battle. Others could be taken as prisoners. It doesn't speak about a whole large scale. It doesn't have to, at least, understood that way. So the Quran, in most cases, the Quran isn't very clear about what's going on there. Not very explicit. This is all about battles, and this is another example of those. So by simply reading the Quran, you don't have to believe that there was a mass killing of Bani Qurayza. It comes from Sirah, biographies of Prophet Muhammad, and some Hadith sources too, which were all written down 150 to 200 years later after Prophet Muhammad. So how accurate these sources are is an endless question in Islam. And of course, more traditionalists think that they are largely accurate. They're established, that's our tradition. But there is a trend to question them by the modernists, and I probably put myself there. First of all, irrelevant with Bani Qurayza, there are things in Hadith, for example, that are supposedly coming from Prophet Muhammad, where the Prophet Muhammad takes side between the sectarian divisions in Islam that happened 150 years later, or he tells people to obey the rulers, which I'm sure the rulers loved those hadiths and circulated them. So there are a lot of reasons to look into later Islamic sources, not the Quran itself, but the secondary sources with a grain of salt. On many stories could be made and projected back there, especially the sectarian ones. I mean, Prophet says the worst of my people are the Qadarites, those who do, these are the people who didn't believe in predestination. Well, that discussion took place, many, many decades later. Prophets getting, his authority into a sectarian division decades later is hard to imagine. I think it's better to think that some people, try to get him behind. So there are reasons on the Qurayza story too. There are a few books written by Muslim scholars on this. One long article, one book. I mentioned them in the book. Now the story. They question the authenticity of the story. And there are details in the story, which kind of sounds bizarre, really, to make it. Like one important one, which is also pointed to by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf that I quoted in the book. If you don't know, for people who may not, he's one of the most probably prominent Islamic scholars in North America. I have great respect for many of his theological perspectives. And he says, for example, I quoted him there, we are told that like 600 men were killed, but before that event, they were arrested and put in a house. How many people can you arrest in a Medinan house? Maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen. No house can have so many people. Just, so the numbers could be inflated. I mean, there's clear that there's some execution of, let's say, combatants of the Jewish tribe of Benu Qurayza, but it's maybe less bloody of a story. And people say, this is Western historians say that these stories of Prophet Muhammad's conquests and wars were written at a time when Muslim empires were engaged in all these bloody conquests and wars. So they amplified Prophet as a warrior. And some Western scholars that I quoted in the book, these are not Muslims, they're saying the stories about the Prophet Muhammad's wars and conquests were written at an imperial age of late Umayyad and early Abbasid empires, which needed a culture of war and conflict and sometimes brutality and they wanted to see the Prophet in that light. They were not emphasizing his tolerance or pluralism as we would do today. They were willing to see him as this mighty warrior. So they think that some of the stories may be inflated or sometimes you see Sunni Shia versions about the Prophet's wars, and the Shia sources highlights certain heroes there, Sunnis others. So I think there is some healthiness in looking into the textual sources of Islam with a grain of salt. And on this issue too, Beni Qurayza issue too, I think there's room to do that. And I entertain that possibility in the chapter about what really happened in Medina.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa.
Yeah, thank you.
Earlier, you mentioned about Caliph Omar bringing the Jewish families back to Jerusalem. But what I was not aware of when I read the book was that Caliph Omar had to negotiate the resettlement of Jews in Jerusalem with a patriarch who strongly opposed it. And I wonder if these stories can be used to amplified to bring our faith communities together.
Yeah, thank you. That's, again, I think people especially in America today, look back into history of these three religions with the concept of a Judeo-Christian tradition in mind. And Islam is the third, distant sometimes cousin at best. But I mean, when you go through the history of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, I say, first of all, there's a triangle here. There's not like two of them on the same side and the other one is separate. And the triangle means theologically they're connected in different ways, and historically too, because in many cases in history, and my book highlights this, Jews and Muslims were on the same side. And Christians were the ones that were, medieval Christianity was not today's tolerant, pluralistic Christianity. There was a lot of religious coercion, oppression, forced conversions. And at the time of the birth of Islam, let's say the emergence of Islam, Jewish-Christian relations were very tense, to put it mildly. For Jews, Byzantium was the most oppressive thing in the world. I mean, they were very worried about the advances of Byzantium. They had a kingdom in the south of Arabia, the kingdom of Himyar. Well, how Jewish that is I think discussed, but it aspired to a Jewish, identity at least, a Judaizing monotheism, as one Jewish scholar calls it. But they were destroyed by Christians, and they were then at some point brutal on Christians, which you see in the Quran. So there's much enmity between Jews and Christians when Islam emerged into the world scene. That's why when Muslims conquered Jerusalem from the Byzantine Christians, there were no Jews there because they had been expelled right before. And the Christians don't want the Jews back in. They see them, as Christ killers. I mean, all these Christian stereotypes at the time. There's also enmity because Jews had sided with the Sassanids in the years just before. And that's very interesting. That's why there is this document that Caliph Omar signs with the Patriarch of Jerusalem. By the way, I mean, Muslims conquer Jerusalem peacefully. That's remarkable in itself. I mean, they win other wars around, but then Jerusalemites surrender and they take the city peacefully. And they say, we're not going to destroy your churches. So that Christians are positively surprised with that. And they're not harming all the Christian places of worship there, which is why there's a Holy Church of Sepulchre in Jerusalem for centuries. It was under Islamic rule for 12 centuries, I think, at least. Anyway, but Christian says, this is all good, but we don't want Jews in, right? I mean, it's actually written in these are the conditions, and Jews will not be permitted in the city. Now, apparently Muslims first agree with that, but then we see that Jews are actually being brought into the city. By Caliph Omar, he negotiates, is it 200 families, then 70 families, it's reduced that, but he actually brings in Jews from Babylonia, from Iraq, and maybe other regions, some Jewish families into Jerusalem. Again, why? Well, first of all, Jews and Christians were hostile to each other at that point. But from an Islamic point of view, there were all people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab. Plus, I think Muslims saw Jews at the time as more reliable, assets there. They were constantly at war with Byzantine Empire. That's the Christian side. Jews were preferring Muslim rule, and Muslims might be aware of that. So probably they wanted to have a friendly group in Jerusalem, and that was the beginning of the Old Quarter in Jerusalem. So, and the same story would be somewhat repeated later when Crusaders came and destroyed and plundered Jerusalem in year 1096. They came to Jerusalem around that time. I mean, it took a while to come from Europe. That's the beginning of the crusade. In the first crusade, they slaughtered Muslims and Jews together, and Jews were again able to return back to Jerusalem after the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem by Salah ad-Din, which is regarded in Islam as a great hero. Now, I think Muslims might not be aware of this, Jews might not be aware of this, and I think it's important for us to remember that Jerusalem was more pluralistic under Islam compared to Byzantine and the Crusader rule. And of course, the modern dynamics are very different and often sad. But I think it's important to recall those. And again, by the way, I mean, I should say Christianity has gone a long way since those times. I appreciate that. I think has gone remarkable and good changes, both in its theology regarding other faiths and also its attitude towards other faiths. I think today that's why Christian West is probably a place that is you have the most highest levels of religious freedom, but Christianity wasn't always like that, and good to, I think, see the spectrum there.
Absolutely. I had one question that I think I was going to ask a little later, but maybe throw it in now because I think it's historically relevant. Which is, I've always been I don't know the answer to this, and I was wondering if you do. Why was it that there was such a strong Jewish presence in Arabia, in Mecca and Medina at the time, of Muhammad, but later on there were no Jews, virtually no Jews in Arabia, except maybe in Yemen, I guess in Yemen, as you say, but there were Jews all through the rest of the Arab and Muslim world. So why was there a reason for that, or what are your thoughts?
I think, unfortunately, gradually there has been a displacement of Jews in Arabia. I think historically you can see that. The question is, was it really something authorized by the Prophet, right? Now, there's a hadith which reads, "Let there be no two religions in Arabia." Based on that hadith, actually, Saudi Arabia has for decades never allowed a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue in the Arabian Peninsula, which is not the case in the rest of Islam, right? I mean, in other Muslim majority countries, you have churches or sometimes even synagogues. I mean, unfortunately, in the 20th century, many Jews were expelled, and that happened out of a political conflict. But theologically, Muslims are not offended by the presence of churches as such. But in the Arabian Peninsula, based on that hadith, "Let there be no two religions in Arabia," it's told that Prophet Muhammad and later Caliph Omar, expelled these Jews. Now, again, in the book, I discussed the authenticity of that hadith. There are actually evidence showing that Jewish communities existed in the first decades after Islam, the birth of Islam.
Mhm.
So which shows that actually that hadith may be a later invention. Maybe Muslims just thought that this is our holy land, let's make it fully secure and let's expel these people. So it could be a political drive, a cultural drive, but it's not coming from the Quran, or it's not probably coming from the Prophet as the historical evidence shows, because evidence shows that there were some Jewish communities in the Arabian Peninsula around Medina and Mecca in the decades after the Prophet. So a lot of things happened in Islamic history, a lot of expulsions, terrible things definitely happened. But the question is it sanctioned by the religion or not? And I tend to say no to that question. In the book, I discuss why I would say no.
Thanks so much. And another question, in terms of reconciling Islam and Judaism then, through history, and today, how do we deal with the fundamental issue that that Islam is a universal faith open to all, and Judaism is a religion of one people that does not aspire to be universal? And that brings us to something you already alluded to, that might not the possibilities for Muslim-Jewish allyship and reconciliation be greater in the US and other Western countries where we are both minority faiths and freedom of liberty is guaranteed for all, at least for right now, than it would have been in the caliphates of old, or in modern day Israel, which defines itself as a Jewish state, or for that matter, Iran, which defines itself as a Islamic republic.
Thank you, Walter. I mean, first of all, the fact that Islam is a universalistic missionary faith, which hopes to convert people to its own theology, and Judaism is not such a faith, that actually makes them very compatible, if you ask me. Because Islam wants to make people monotheists, and Jews are already monotheists, and Jews are not. There's no competition between the two religions about who are you going to convert. Between Islam and there's Christianity, there is competition, right? And it can be a healthy competition. I mean, competitions are not bad. I believe in a free market of religions, as I always say, and it's good for them to compete peacefully and of course with certain respect. But we'll try to win people by our religion is better. They can have those conversations and those efforts in a medium of religious freedom. But with Islam, there's a beginning of the quote. I mean, in the book, actually, I took the quote from Sheikh Hamza, which in passing, he said, Islam is Judaism for Gentiles. Like,
Right.
From an Islamic point of view, Jews are already monotheists. They're following the halakha. They're already following God's wish. Problem solved. But the rest of humanity should also believe in the God of Abraham and Isaac and Moses in a monotheistic Unitarian way. That's the Islamic message. So I don't see any theological incompatibility there.
Okay.
And especially if Jews are given equal citizenship rights in Muslim majority countries, which was, again, the late Ottoman Empire actually had come to that point. And today you have that status for Jews in some Muslim majority countries. That's good. I mean, from Bosnia to Indonesia, not countries that are, of course, run by a kind of Islamic law perspective, but a more secular liberal perspective. You have Jews and Muslim citizens. I mean, in Turkey too, where I come from, unfortunately, I mean, the tensions over Israel and Palestine made Turkish Jews uncomfortable in the past couple of decades, understandably so. But I mean, Turkish Jews are equal citizens in Turkey and with other Turks. And if they faced a major problem in the past 20th century, it's because of nationalism more than I think directly religion. So I don't see much incompatibility. But regarding the West, when we come to the West in America, especially in Europe, actually the two religions are structurally so similar. That's why they have similar pathways in liberal democracies, and similar sometimes problems or similar requirements. One thing European countries, some European countries, Jews and Muslims have faced is that there are some European laws or movements to ban halal or kosher slaughter, which are very similar practices. Or in France, there are laws banning explicit religious symbols. That could be a kippah or a headscarf. The main concern is there probably the headscarf, but also Jews get targeted by that. Oh, or there are schools which don't want to allow any exceptions for halal or kosher food and want to serve pork to all students. There are discussions about male circumcision. Since Islam and Judaism are very similar religious traditions, they have similar practices, which puts them together. I mean, there emerged these Jewish-Muslim councils for religious freedom in the past couple of decades. In America, there are Aryan supremacists, right, who don't want us. You will not replace us, either Jews or Muslims. I mean, they have this crazy conspiracy theory about, I don't know, people being replaced ethnically, racially. We are all Semites, right? I mean, we are not in a Christian white nation, and I'm not saying this is a pejoratively, it's just the way people are, but these are Semitic people with a different religion. So they have similar concerns, and they've been attacked by same people. I mean, fascist, racists attacked synagogues and mosques with the same mindset. So there are those concerns. And also, how do you function as a religious community in a free society? Actually, Jews have some answers there that is interesting for Muslims, because Jews have entered into modernity before Muslims historically. I mean, Jews learned that, I mean, you can practice the halakha without a halakhic state. You know, as a community, you can practice it. You can have a bet din, a religious court law. I mean, a religious court that manages the communal affairs, not as a law of the land. Muslims actually took an inspiration from this and established Sharia courts in the UK, again, which works as an arbitration court on marriage and divorce and other family issues. So actually, if you could resolve Israel and Palestine, Jews and Muslims would look at each other and say, well, like, we are the closest people on earth. I mean, we have so much in common, which is already there, that dynamic. But unfortunately, the political conflict in the Middle East has overshadowed to some extent. But I do believe, I mean, there are many centuries ahead. Jews and Islam are two monotheistic traditions which will coexist in this world. And we should emphasize the links between them, the commonalities between them, and hope that it can have a positive impact back in the terrible, heartbreaking violence, conflict in the Middle East.
So, Mustafa, speaking of commonalities, in reading your book, I was fascinated to learn that the Ottoman Empire was not only a place of refuge for the Jews fleeing persecution, but the Jews remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire till its very end. Can you share some of those key moments, like the Sarajevo Haggadah or the blood libel story?
Yeah, I mean, the Jewish experience with the Ottoman Empire is an interesting story in itself. That's the last chapter of my book, actually, right? The Ottoman Haven. And I begin by telling how the last Ottoman Caliph was expelled from Turkey in 1924. And he was said farewell by an Ottoman Jew very warmly. And he was surprised. And he said, your monarchy saved our ancestors from Spain. I mean, of course, the most important, I think, historically recognizable element there is Ottoman Empire offering a safe haven to Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492. They were forced to either convert to Christianity or leave. And leaving was not an easy thing at the time, and people were carried out by pirates, and they sometimes thrown into the sea. Bandits open their bellies to see gold there. Or I mean, just expulsion is, especially in these conditions, in the modern day too. I mean, it's just a horrific thing. You lose a lot of people on the way, and you lose all your life and belongings and everything. So many Sephardic Jews came into the Ottoman Empire. They became a part of the Ottoman millet system, where Muslims were the ruling people, but Christians had their own institutions, Armenians and Greeks, and Jews, their institutions, religious traditions. And several historians said that, I mean, Ottoman Empire became the best place for Jews to live in the next few centuries. There has been Jewish migrations to the Ottoman Empire from Europe as well, some Ashkenazi communities came to Europe as well. And actually, there's this famous letter by a rabbi, Sarfati, in the 15th century. He says, why don't you come to Turkey? I mean, leave that place, a cursed land called Germany, and come to Turkey where you have freedom here and we can practice our religion. Interestingly, Jewish migration was towards the Muslim land for several centuries. Today, it's the opposite. Right? In the 20th century, it became the opposite, and we should see both of these facts. The other one is, of course, the second one is a sad one. And not just Jewish, but religious minorities escaping the Muslim world. It's a pattern, but it was the other way around until a few centuries ago. The Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman Empire, also Jews flourished. I mean, by the way, Walter, I think you mentioned ghetto. Jews were not close to ghettos in the Ottoman Empire or generally in the Muslim world. There might be some exceptions, but ghetto, it was a European experience. Jews had neighborhoods where they clustered, and it was better for them to live that way, but it was not like a sealed ghetto that you couldn't get out. They could travel, they could trade. There were distinctive clothing, for example, for the Dhimmis, but that was also because in medieval times, people should know which religion are you from, because that's also your legal status, right? I mean, there's no law of the land, there are law of communities, different communities. So is it discriminatory? Maybe yes, but also Muslims wanted to know who's a Muslim, who's a non-Muslim. So it was just the way the society was organized. Now, one thing that I emphasize in the Ottoman story is that the Ottoman Empire also saw anti-Semitism, especially in the 19th century. And I think the most dramatic example of that is the blood libel of Damascus in 1840. Now, blood libel was a European invention, a European nonsense. And Muslims didn't know about this. I mean, there's no Islamic literature about this. And ultimately, blood libel reached the Ottoman Empire at the hands of Christians. And the blood libel of Damascus in 1840 was tossed up by the Catholic clerics in the city. It was backed up by the French consulate. France was a pretty anti-Semitic country in the 19th century. Dreyfus Affair and all that, you can recall. At least there were anti-Semitic trends in France, I should say. It's more clear, more accurately. And the Ottoman Sultan ultimately saved the Jews of Damascus from persecution, torture because of the blood libel with a firman, that's an edict, imperial edict, which is still in the display in the Ottoman Jewish Museum in Istanbul, saying that, I mean, Jewish people will be protected from this calumny. It's a pure calumny. And he says, our scholars look into the religious writings of the Jews. They don't even use animal blood for anything. I mean, this is total nonsense. And that edict saved. Now, it's sad that blood libel then entered into Middle Eastern narratives, unfortunately, in the 20th century, but it was a totally new, a bad novelty, I think, in the Muslim world. Now, I emphasize Jews were loyal to the Ottoman Empire. There's a reason for that, because there's a narrative in the 20th century by some hardline Islamists or nationalist circles that the non-Muslims betrayed the Ottoman Empire. You know, they kind of were working against it secretly within. Now, I mean, they might have national aspirations which led them to certain directions. That's certainly the case with some national Christian communities. But you don't see that even among Ottoman Jews. For Ottoman Jews, Ottoman Empire was the best place they found. They were loyal to they were happy with the Ottoman Empire. They supported the empire when Ottomans were fighting the Russians. They were praying for Ottoman success. And the British also, Jews were very supportive of the Ottoman Empire, in its especially struggles with the Russians. And the Russians were the real anti-Semitic force in history. And so I kind of wanted to also refute this narrative of the treacherous minority within, you know, which is a total later narrative that appeared in connection to the Young Turks, but it's not historically accurate, and that's why I wanted to emphasize that.
Might that have had something to do also with the beginning of Zionism, which after all starts in 1897, and you know, you have Herzl and Ben Gurion and Weizmann all, you know, kind of appealing to the Sultan to, allow the Jews, a Jewish homeland essentially. So you have the last 20 years or so of the Ottoman Empire, you did have that dynamic.
You did, but that's a European dynamic. And I mean, Zionists may have looked up to a world after the Ottoman Empire. Ultimately, the British certainly helped them with the Balfour Declaration. But my emphasis on loyalty is about Ottoman Jews themselves. I mean, you wouldn't expect a European Jew to be loyal. They're not citizens of the empire as well. But for Ottoman Jews, they were happy with the empire. They supported it. There is no Jewish rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. There's an Armenian rebellion, there's a Greek rebellion, and the Ottomans responded heavily in certain cases, which led to horrific disaster, like expulsions like Armenians in 1915. So there are a lot of sad stories towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. But that's the Christian minorities, which were supported by outside powers like Russia or European or France or Britain. Nobody supported the Jews. And Jews were actually happy with the Ottoman Empire. And my emphasis there is also partly to refute this conspiracy theory that, the Young Turks came, they were puppets of Jews or Zionists. That's not true. I mean, the Young Turks were a militantly nationalist cadre which made huge mistakes, but they're trying to save the empire. And there were a few Jews in the late Ottoman Empire in the bureaucracy or in the parliament, but it's not this conspiratorial scheme that some people made it into. So in the book, I discussed that. Now, it's not an accident that Zionism emerges in Europe and Russia, because these are the lands that Jews were really heavily persecuted or discriminated against. Absolutely. I'm not pointing to this as saying it was unnecessary or not to make that case, but it's not an accident that Russia, especially, I mean, a lot of people had to escape Russia, or Austria, and ultimately Germany, right? I mean, so that's the dynamic. And Zionism emerged in a world of nation states. It's a nation state project. I understand what nation state projects exist, but they can be very destructive, right? And that's why we have to tame nationalisms and try to minimize the conflicts between them, which is how I see the current state of affairs between Israel and Palestine as well. Well, I'm jumping into a new question maybe, but
That's fine. Well, actually, before we get to that, I wanted to go way back to the very beginning again.
Yeah.
Back to the Exodus, back to the Islamic Moses. And basically, the question was that in your exposition in this wonderful book, you talk about some of the differences between how the Moses story, the Exodus story, is played out in the Quran from the Torah. And you say that I believe you're saying that the Islamic presentation is much more universalistic in its application, in its lesson, than is the Torah story, which is really about let my people go, and sort of full, about the children of Israel being able to regain their freedom and leave Egypt. But I was curious. So I think that for example, you say that in the Quran Moses urges Pharaoh to accept monotheism, whereas the Torah focuses again on the Jews leaving Egypt and so forth. But if so, here I was really interested. Does the Quran also say that Moses insisted that the Pharaoh should allow the Jews to leave Egypt and thereby return to their homeland, rather than merely ending their bondage and securing justice for all peoples, which you would think would be, if that was the lesson, the more universal aspect, why, I'm just curious, why would that piece about the Pharaoh, Moses telling the Pharaoh to let the Jews leave, why would that still be in there? And is this in any way an acknowledgement by Islam that the land of Israel is the land of the Jews?
Very good question. I mean, there is in the Quran a reference to, I have to check the actually passages now again to give you the full bumpers and everything, but
Mhm.
there is a mention of the promised land in the Quran, and Moses leading people to this promised land. And so it's not unthinkable from an Islamic point of view that Jews have a claim to this land. I mean, and I think it should not be doubted. Whether that means in the 21st century, Jewish people should establish a nation state from the river to the sea, all of it, and leaving no country to Palestinians, well, that's a different discussion. My answer would be no. Of course, they have a claim, and the Quran even refers to the promised land idea, and you can see in the conversation between the Moses and the Israelites in the Quran. Which is fine. I mean, that's why the Ottoman Empire allowed Jews to be there, and there have been Jewish communities throughout history. Of course, we don't have an Ottoman Empire anymore, unfortunately. Like, empires are gone. Anyway, I'm not trying to revive it. Of course, this is a world of nation states. How do we make the Jewish claim, legitimate Jewish claim and connection to the land of Israel, with the very legitimate and Palestinian claim to be people living there for centuries and centuries, right? So these are two peoples who says this land, we are tied to this land. And if you are sympathetic to the one side, you might find one maybe more compelling if you're sympathetic to the other side. But you have to make these people to live in this land in peace. And I think Muslims who says they have nothing to do with this land, I think they're making a mistake. And even if you say that, that's not going to change anything. It's about how people feel and believe, right? You cannot convince a people that their national aspirations are not necessary or not. I mean, it's just there. It's built by history, theology. It's not just going to disappear. The problem, of course, is that this is a small land and these two people claim it. And there are people, certainly maximalists on both sides, who want to have it all for themselves. And I think that's the root of our problem here. And the question is, can we make them share this land? Can we make them coexist on this land? What's the political formula for it? Is it a two-state solution? Is it a confederal solution? Whatever solution people can propose. I'm neither Israeli nor Palestinian, so I don't want to step out of my, I don't want to be arrogant to say this should be the solution. It's between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But from a Muslim point of view, I can say that there are references in the Quran to a promised land that the Moses was bringing the Israelites. That should help us Muslims to understand that Jewish people have a deep connection to the land. Of course, we have Jews and Christians and Muslims too. I mean, there are a lot of Palestinian Christians too. There are other people living there for centuries. The homes they were living is their grandfathers, and so none of them should be delegitimized in their connection to this land, and we should find a way to help them coexist without violence. I know it's a very difficult question, but that's the, I think, right ethical perspective.
So is the conflict between Muslims and Jews today a religious war?
I think not. I think it's a national war. It's a national conflict. But it become religionized. Religion has entered into the scene, often as an exacerbating factor, making things more militant.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can see this. First of all, in the history, I mean, Zionism was not a religious movement. It was actually a very secular movement to establish a secular nation state. Most religious Jews were not interested in it. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, and Walter, but and in the Muslim scene, Palestinian movement was mostly first of all, a secular socialist, revolutionary movement. I mean, the Palestinian movement in, let's say, between the 48 and 67, at least, the Fatah and so on and so forth. And the question here is not which religion is true, right? It's not people trying to convert each other to the true religion. It's about whose land is this. it's not too different from many national conflicts that has happened between in the Ottoman territories, in the Balkans, Serbs, Bosnians, Greeks, Albanians. So there's a horrific century of violence, which, you know, came, which was revived, unfortunately, in the early 90s with the genocide against Bosnians, and the Turkish-Armenian conflict, which led to the horrific expulsion of 1915, massacres, mass killings, and horrific stories. So that is also, so is that a religion? Well, two people claim the same land. They happen to have a religion. They, of course, go and find in that religion some ideas to empower them in this battle, plus religious narratives about the promised land. I mean, in Israel, in the far right camp, the narrative of Amalekites entered into the scene, which has been very concerning to me from the days of Baruch Goldstein and terrorism, and to today, some of the extremist perspectives in Israel, which are in the government. I'm really horrified.
Absolutely.
To see. And the Islamic in the Muslim camp, again, Islam as a dominant theme in the Palestinian movement is a relatively late development, but it became elucidated in the case of Hamas, and Hamas brought in religious narratives, and again, uncompromising religious narratives, referring to certain Quranic chapters for conflict, using a illegit hadith about Jews hiding behind a tree and Muslims fighting with them. I don't believe in the authenticity of that, and I discussed that in the book briefly in the epilogue. And these views came in. So I think a national conflict has been exacerbated by religion. The worst, expressions of religion I think you can find on both sides at this point. But I think that's precisely why we should also put on the table more mature, more moderate, more peaceful interpretations of religion as well. And that's one point, one idea behind my book is that, to show that here's a Islamic way of thinking about all this in a way that can contribute to peace instead of, fanning the flames for more violence.
So in that case, could religion be part of the solution as opposed to the problem?
Exactly. It has to be. Otherwise, people see it through religious lens, a lot of people. And of course, in the Muslim world as well, the conflict, although it's a land conflict, just all 2 billion Muslims among, this issue has been for decades and decades a very important issue, right? The persecution of the Palestinians, the sympathy for them, which is all very legitimate. But how do you stand with the Palestinians? Do you take it to a level of anti-Semitism? Do you take it to a level of hatred against Jews, which has happened, unfortunately? And that makes it more difficult to resolve because it hardens attitudes on the other side. And the narratives of Amalek and all that, it hardens attitudes on this side. So there is this vicious cycle of extreme narratives empowering each other. And I try to go in the book in different parts, like go against one of these narratives or go against the other narratives, at least to show an alternative way of reading our textual sources, our historical sources, and to say we need peace. And this is a time when people may not be willing to hear all that. It's so much, but what's the alternative we have? Like forever war between Israel and its supporters and 2 billion Muslims. It's a horrific scenario, and we are at actually a very dangerous phase right now. It can go worse and worse, and I hope not. That's why I think all responsible people on both sides should still try to de-escalate, end the current wave of violence, ceasefire, and then think of how do we make these two peoples exist, and building a broader understanding between Jews and Muslims.
And we often hear the statement that Hamas is committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. Is that still true?
I think that is true, but also it's true that some forces in Israel are committed to the destruction of any Palestinian state. From the river to the sea, that slogan has been, of course, very disturbing to people in some Jewish communities, and it's a lot discussed issue in the US. Well, both sides are using that slogan. I mean,
Yeah.
both sides are saying from the river to the sea, it's ours. One has more power and actually is getting close to doing that. And now, on the other
Now, there
hand,
is a modified charter of the Hamas that was
there is a
re-
modified charter of the Hamas, which actually leaves behind some of the anti-Semitic religious narratives. That's good. They also there said that although we are committed to the whole Palestine, I mean the historical Palestine, if the Palestinian actually people agree on a diplomatic solution, we are open to going that way. So I don't want to give the full quotation here, but they actually at times Hamas hinted that although ideally they would still be willing to get it, but they could live with a diplomatic solution based on 67 borders. Now, maybe that was a more moderate wing in Hamas, and the wing in Gaza was representing a more hardline view, which led to, unfortunately, horrific October 7 attacks. But it's a possibility. And I think, on the other hand, in Israel, I know there are people who actually would be happy with a two-state solution, but they're saying, well, not now. But when do you get there? I mean, so I think there's an interesting spectrum on both sides. You can really see mirror images of certain positions on the other side. People who want to have a democratic one state, people who would be happy with a confederation, people who want to go back to 67 borders, pre-67, which is what I historically, supported. But now I mean, what do you do with the settlements? $1 million question.
Yeah.
I think the U.S. governments have some blame here by really not taking a stance here towards peace, just letting this thing fester and think that it would just magically go away with a few deals between Israel and a few unrelated Arab capitals like in UAE. And well, we will see what is coming now regarding the U.S. But yeah, I think indeed. I mean, anyone who criticizes one position here, remind them, yes, that's a very concerning position. And you really have something like that on the other side too. So do not demonize one people versus the other. Let's just understand the conflict radicalizes people, the conflict itself. It's not that they are inherently violent and intolerant and
Exactly.
people. It's just the conflict itself does it to people. I've seen this in all Ottoman territories. I mean, I've seen this in former Yugoslavia. I've seen this in Anatolia. It's a scary thing. I mean, nationalism is a very scary thing, and if it's not tamed, then the good option is you have something like a Dayton Agreement in 1995, which ends the Civil War and gives two sides some future they can live with. Not the most ideal that they would both want, but still end the war. Or you just are in a perpetual war with huge repercussions around.
Tell us about your motto in the epilogue, because you had written this book prior to October 7th. And then in your epilogue, you start off with your vision for peace. But tell us about your motto.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, indeed, I mean, I gave the book's first draft to my editors at St. Martin's Press in late September, and then came October 7th, or maybe 2 weeks later. And I begin with a tweet of mine. I said, like, on that day, I'm horrified to see the terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians. I'm now also worried what will this bring on to Gaza itself, and this vicious cycle of violence is endless. And I said, and it is, and it's gotten to worse. It got worse and worse, more than what I could even imagine. I think regarding Gaza. Now where it will head to West Bank or Lebanon is already. So it's probably the worst phase that we have seen in 100 years. Now, in the epilogue, I challenge some narratives that makes it impossible to resolve, if you ask me, this conflict. One is narratives on both sides, and one is, I say that the decolonization narrative. That is very popular on the pro-Palestinian camp. I understand people's, of course, frustration and sympathy for the civilians. I share those. But how do you solve this problem? Oh, this is a European colony. It will be decolonized, right? And then that is used to justify, by the way, indiscriminate violence. That's a part of the problem. But also, there is this view that Israel came from the West, just like the French came to Algeria. 100-something years later, the French were kicked out. Algeria became independent. So that's the roadmap. So some people see it this way on the pro-Palestinian camp. I say this is a misleading and dangerous way to see this, because colonial powers knew that they were colonial powers. They had a homeland. They had come there to Algeria or Palestine itself, the British, for some interests, for some gains. When they can't get it, they go back. I mean, they have a country to return to. Israelis do not see themselves as a colonial power, so they will not leave the country. They will fight until the last, bit. And that's not a smart thing to push a country towards an existential fear with this narrative. It fires back, as we're seeing. That's not realistic and dangerous. On the other hand, the pro-Israeli camp has this narrative that this is a problem of terrorism, extremism. True, there's terrorism, there's extremism, that's bad. When Hamas attacks Israel's civilians, that is terrorism, and I'm against that. But this comes out of a context. I mean, it just doesn't come out of people's viciousness and inherent nature of the people there. It comes from the very fact that this is a nation that has not found its homeland for a century. And unless there's a political solution, military solution, which is bombing your way out of this, will only bring more and more destruction. So these two concepts has to be left aside, and we should understand this as a national conflict. National conflicts have been resolved in history sometimes. I mean, you create some live and let live solution. I mean, Dayton is one example. The IRA and the British government, their conflict, smaller than this, but it was a land dispute again. It was a conflict over land and territory and domination. Good Friday Agreement at least put an end to the violent phase of that. I think we should look into those conflicts and take as an inspiration and understand that it's not a religious war between Jews and Muslims, but it is putting us apart. And I think reasonable people, responsible people on both sides have the responsibility to put out a more humane perspective of what our view is and should be. We're losing that rapidly, unfortunately, today. I've lost it in the past year.
Well, Mustafa, first of all, thank you so much for that. And I know both Sabi and I couldn't agree more with you on what you just laid out. And, we're all trying to be voices for that kind of, moderation and reconciliation. And as you say, there are things going on there, groups like Standing Together and others, I think, which are role modeling that, but at this point, a small, unfortunately, still a minority. So the conflict continues over there, and for the last question I think we have is, what about here? Where you live, where Sabi and I live, where something like 12 to 15 million Jews and Muslims live. How are we gonna cope here now? Especially in light of what happened last week with the elections, and which seems to be part of America turning away from democracy, pluralism, and religious liberty for all faiths toward a kind of authoritarianism and white Christian nationalism. So if that is happening, what are the stakes for our communities and the rest of America to find out, to find a way to come together here and be a force to prevent that from happening. And the Israel-Palestine piece relates to that so much, because that's what's really pushed us apart and made that cooperation harder in the last year, certainly. But it will, now that we see where this is going, will it be possible for us to agree to disagree when necessary on Israel-Palestine, on aspects of how what the nature of the settlement should be over there, but to stand together here in support of common interest of preserving democracy and pluralism here at home, which I think neither of our communities will have a decent life if we have to live under a kind of authoritarian Christian nationalism.
Well, I'm still new in America and trying to learn my ways here and trying to learn the ways. So I'm concerned with the direction in this country of the political culture and the new formulations. One thing I see in America is extreme polarization in politics, tribalism over politics, which in my home country, Turkey, which brought terrible results. So it's not a good thing. And I think people should try to de-escalate it as much as they can. Of course, with the Trump administration, a second one, we will see what's awaiting us. But I think regarding, especially on this issue, without getting into too much into U.S. politics itself, I should say in both, I think, as I see in Muslim and Jewish communities in the past year, there is a tendency to close yourself to the other side, to stick together, build narratives about the other side, and there are entrepreneurs in our communities which kind of surf on that distrust and, maybe sometimes pump that. That's not going to bring anything good. Like, there is no victory here for either side, at least a victory that we can really hope for. Whatever happens, I mean, annexation of West Bank, maybe that's coming. I don't know, God forbid. But I mean, Israel destroyed PLO back in Lebanon in 82, and then they went to Tunisia, I mean, if you destroy Hamas, there might be a Hamas 2.0 5 years later somewhere else. I mean, this is a whole geography. There are 200 million Arabs, 2 billion Muslims, and people will keep feeling for this. It will have terrible consequences. It will have terrible consequences if Israel cannot find a peaceful way to, end this conflict. Same thing with Muslims. There is no good solution of ending Zionism and decolonizing and all that. I mean, Israel is a nation state. It's not going to give up. And the more you corner it, the more it will become more Ben Gvir-like, and it will, as we've seen, right? I mean, and so, what Hamas did, not just with October 7th, but even before with the Second Intifada, with the suicide attack, empower the hawks in Israel and weaken the peace camp.
Yes.
What we should do is exactly the opposite. Empower not the hawks, but the moderates on the other side. So I think we need this within communities, religious communities in America as well. Since the beginning of this, I'm in touch with some Jewish friends, and I said, look, children are dying in Gaza, thousands. Like, I'm horrified with this. And most of them say, yes, we know. We are also sad with you. So just hearing that, and then how can we have and I should say, well, I was horrified by the murders of October 7th too, in the kibbutzim and all the children and the families, and horrified and terrorized. So I think feeling the empathy, feeling the humaneness of the other side is important. We should have more. Some people say this is over. Dialogue is. No, precisely. I think this is the time we need more of that. It's a little bit about the war, the conflict, and the pain, but also then there will be broader issues of our religions, that hadith, that text, is it Amalek or Jews hiding behind a tree? That hadith, like, honest conversation. Maybe we have troubles also in our religious traditions about the interpretation of these things. I think the more we bring in that, because we will live in this country together, right? Whatever happens there, we will either live in a growingly skeptical, suspicious, bitter, closed universe.
Right.
Or we will understand the empathy understand the humanity of the other side and bring in some empathy. That's what's needed. I don't know how to exactly do it, but well, just keep up the podcast. You're doing it, right? I think we need more of this, and I'm glad even this conversation might be a tiny contribution to that.
Mustafa, this conversation will be a huge contribution towards that. Just listening to you and you sharing your thoughts and your vision and the history is something that I'm positive will enhance the message of peace. And may your message of peace resonate, and may we find peace in our nation and in our world and in our hearts. And
Thank you,
I
Sabina.
urge all our viewers and listeners to please read the book. We've only covered a part of it. There's so much more in here that can bring forth our message of peace. Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. It was really, really inspirational.
Thank you.